Good evening, everybody. First of all, apologies for a little technical difficulty, but our techno wizard, Beth Golay, is going to record this and put it up on our website, so you'll be seeing it after the fact. And it will also go on Facebook, but not live. And we apologize for that, but for some reason, the internet was not our friend tonight. I am delighted to be here to welcome Helen Phillips and Gillian Flynn for a virtual event here, not exactly in the store. First, ladies, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being the authors that you are, because you've given all of us an amazing amount of reading pleasure over the years. Helen is with us, she's with us from Colorado. She was born and raised in Colorado and is in Brooklyn now, but has traversed the country and is in Colorado, drove through the massive Durango, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, with her children and family to get to Colorado to be with more family. So she's coming to us from Colorado, and Gillian is coming to us from here in Chicago. So we're happy to have you both here. We are celebrating tonight Helen's book, The Need. It is not her first book. She's written 4 books previous to that. She wrote Some Possible Solutions, which is a collection of short stories, The Beautiful Bureaucrat, which is a novel, and Yet They Were Happy, which is also a collection of stories, kind of different genre stories, and then Where the Sun Beams Green, which is a children's book. Gillian, as many of you are aware, has written Sharp Objects, Dark Places, Gone Girl, and maybe some of you are not aware that she also has written a ghost story called The Grown Up, which I think maybe later on she'll follow up Helen's conversation and tell us a little bit about that. I hope maybe she will. Ladies, I think I'm going to turn it over to you. Helen, I think, is going to treat us all to a portion of her book, which I'm thrilled that we will all have a chance to experience. And I'd like to remind everybody in the audience, if you have questions, we are going to try to have you post questions on our Facebook page and then forward them to Helen, and then we'll try to put the answers back up on the Facebook page afterwards. So that seems to be our best method of handling questions at this point. Thanks so much for being with us, and have at it. Helen?
Thank you so much, Mary, for that introduction, and Beth for helping with the technical stuff, and especially Gillian for making the time to talk to me. As I was saying a moment ago in the waiting room, your work means a lot to me, so it's really particularly incredible to be able to speak with you tonight. So I'll begin by reading the first chapter of The Need, and then we can dive right in. It's about, it's pretty quick. It's about a 6-minute reading. Chapter 1. She crouched in front of the mirror in the dark, clinging to them, the baby in her right arm, the child in her left. There were footsteps in the other room. She had heard them an instant ago. She had switched off the light, scooped up her son, pulled her daughter across the bedroom to hide in the far corner. She had heard footsteps. But she was sometimes hearing things, a passing ambulance mistaken for Ben's nighttime wail, the moaning hinges of the bathroom cabinet mistaken for Viv's impatient pre-tantrum sigh. Her heart and blood were loud. She needed them to not be so loud. Another step. Or was it a soft hiccup from Ben? Or was it her own knee joint cracking beneath 36 pounds of Viv? She guessed the intruder was in the middle of the living room now, halfway to the bedroom. She knew there was no intruder. Viv smiled at her in the feeble light of the faraway street lamp. Viv always craved games that were slightly frightening. Any second now, she would demand the next move in this wondrous new one. Her desperation for her children's silence manifested as a suffocating force, the desire for a pillow, a pair of thick socks, anything she could shove into them to perfect their muteness and save their lives. Another step, hesitant but undeniable, or maybe not. Ben was drowsy, tranquil, his thumb in his mouth. Viv was looking at her with curious, cunning eyes. David was on a plane somewhere over another continent. The babysitter had marched off to get a Friday night beer with her girls. Could she squeeze the children under the bed and go out to confront the intruder on her own? Could she press them into the closet, keep them safe among her shoes? Her phone was in the other room in her bag, dropped and forgotten by the front door when she arrived home from work 25 minutes ago, to a blueberry-stained Ben, to Viv parading through the living room chanting "Birthday, birthday," with an uncapped purple marker held aloft in her right hand like the Statue of Liberty's torch. "Viv," she had roared when the marker grazed the white wall of the hallway as her daughter ran toward her. But to no avail, a purple scar to join the others, the green crayon, the red pencil. A Friday night beer with my girls. How exotic, she had thought distantly, handing over the wad of cash. Erica was 23 and buoyant and brave. She had wanted, above all else, someone brave to look after the children. "Now what?" Viv said, starting to strain against her arm. Thankfully, a stage whisper rather than a shriek. But even so, the footsteps shifted direction toward the bedroom. If David were home in the basement practicing, she would be stomping their code on the floor 5 times for "come up right this second," usually because both kids needed everything from her at once. A step, a step. This problem of hers had begun about 4 years ago, soon after Viv's birth. She confessed it only to David, wanting to know if he ever experienced the same sensation, trying and failing to capture it in words. The minor disorientations that sometimes plagued her, the small errors of eyes and ears, the conviction that the rumble underfoot was due to an earthquake rather than a garbage truck, the conviction that there was something slightly off about a piece of litter found amid the fossils in the pit at work, a brief flash or dizziness that, for a millisecond, caused reality to shimmer or waver or disintegrate slightly. In those instants, her best recourse was to steady her body against something solid, David if he happened to be nearby, or a table, a tree, or the dirt wall of the pit, until the world resettled into known patterns and she could once more move invincible, unshakable through her day. Yes, David said whenever she brought it up. He knew what she meant, kind of. His diagnosis, sleep deprivation and or dehydration. Viv squirmed out of her grasp. She was a slippery kid and, with only one arm freed, there was no way Molly could prevent her daughter's escape. "Stay. Right here," she mouthed with all the intensity she could infuse into a voiceless command. But Viv tiptoed theatrically toward the bedroom door, which was open just a crack, and grinned back at her mother, the grin turned grimace by the eerie light of the street lamp. Molly didn't know whether to move or stay put. Any quick action, a hurl across the room, a seizure of the t-shirt, was sure to unleash a scream or a laugh from Viv, was sure to disrupt Ben, lulled nearly to sleep by the panicked bouncing of Molly's arm. Viv pulled the door open. Molly had never before noticed that the bedroom door squeaked, a sound that now seemed intolerably loud. It would be so funny to tell David about this when he landed. I turned off the light and made the kids hide in the corner of the bedroom. I was totally petrified, and it was nothing. Beneath the hilarity would lie her concern about this little problem of hers, but their laughter would neutralize it, almost. She listened hard for the footsteps. There were none. She stood up. She raised Ben's limp, snoozing body to her chest. She flicked the light back on. The room looked warm, orderly. The gray quilt tucked tight at the corners. She would make mac and cheese. She would thaw some peas. She stepped toward the doorway where Viv stood still, peering out. "Who's that guy?" Viv said. That's the end.
Oh, you know how to end a chapter because no one is going to stop reading after that. What I love about that opening is it's so recognizable to any parents. It's such that recognizable, that combination, am I overreacting or am I underreacting, and not knowing which one it is, but it probably has to be something, the talking through of how you tell your spouse that, turn it into a funny story, the different ways that you could escape and it might go wrong, or all that. Like there's so much that's so recognizable there and so beautifully done. Tell me just about the need, and if you started trying to go after a certain theme, and that this would be the correct way to write it, or was it a character? Was it an emotion? Maybe you could just kind of get into with, for you, how a book like The Need becomes the book.
Well, it's very interesting to me, the different places that people begin, because I feel like there are so many different ways that writers begin their books. I was on a panel once and people were asked, how do you begin? And one person said with character and another person said with plot. And for me, the answer to that is with images. So for me, my books are the first step for me is just gathering a list of images around some themes that I want to explore, but it always comes to me as these really vivid, intense images. So the first line of the book, she crouched in front of the dark, clinging to them, that was the first line of the book from the very beginning. And I would say almost every other line changed in the entire book, but this image of a woman in the dark, alone, with one child in one hand and the other child in the other, feeling threatened, that image was there from the get-go. And I did have a moment. The answer to this question is so rambling because, as I'm sure you experienced too, there's so many different sources for any work. But I did have a moment when my older child, my daughter, was a few months old. My husband was out. I was nursing the baby. I was half naked, as one so often is at that time, and I thought I heard footsteps in the other room in our little Brooklyn apartment. And for a second, just half an instant, I had this feeling of, wait, what would I do if there was an intruder in the house? What would I feel so vulnerable right now, and I'm not even the most vulnerable person in the situation. And so it grew out of that. It was just half a second. I wasn't even that scared, but for half a second I had a mortal fear.
Yeah. Yeah. And then did you go return to nursing and start thinking about what this book might be, or is it a fleeting thought and then it comes back to you a couple weeks later and you start thinking, maybe this is something, or do you even know what happens?
I usually, so when I'm working on a novel or starting to think about a novel, for a couple of years, every little weird moments that are happening in my life, I just make a note of them in a very messy, completely disorganized Word document. So I would have typed that in, like, breastfeeding, naked, intruder, and so I did save it in that kind of disjointed form. But that image and that sensation I had of this just ferocious desire to protect my child, and because it was my first experience with motherhood, I had never quite so dramatically valued someone else's life more than I valued my own life. Yeah. And so I think that in that moment I was like, oh wow, I value her life more than I value my own. That was a new experience.
New, yeah. Yeah, I don't think you don't fully understand fear maybe until you have that first child, or you certainly experience fear in a whole new way. I was 39 when I had our first child, and so I'd spent a good deal of my grown-up life only having to worry about myself, and it was that sort of like, oh, this is a whole different thing.
Yeah, and not only fear, but also that you're so responsible, you're so implicated, that you are just bonded to this life in a way that is, I had never had a bond like that in my life before.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you wrote The Need during a particularly emotional time in your life. You had a child and you'd also just lost your sister. And I know you've talked before about reconciling these wildly different emotions, and that you were needed to go through and needed to feel, but how completely jarring it was. Was writing a way to, was it pragmatism? Was there a way to take that emotion and use it in a constructive way, or was your brain already kind of going in the direction of the book and it just became a repository for life?
I wrote the book. My daughter was born in 2012, and then 8 weeks after my daughter was born, my first child, my sister died. And so that summer just coming into new motherhood, which was both the most joyous and terrifying experience, and then at the same time losing a sister, and also watching my parents lose their firstborn daughter. It was yes, I was just being pulled emotionally in two different directions at the same time, and yet the two events seemed so entwined. And so I was just thinking a lot about that ferocious maternal love and that ferocious maternal loss that my own mother was experiencing. And so it wasn't until some years later that I was really starting to find a way to write about some of that intensity. I mean, the book is not autobiographical at all, but it certainly has these questions about motherhood and loss and that ferocity of that love. And so the book was a way, I mean, the book is in a dark place. It's hard. It was hard to write. There were moments in the writing of it where I was writing about dark emotions that are hard to confront. But I think that with those kinds of things, they're going to be present anyway. That anxiety, that grief is going to be present anyway. And for me, figuring out ways to try to articulate it in language, I feel like that's why I write, to try to articulate in language things that really can't be articulated in language. And something about that attempt, even if it falls short, is not exactly soothing, but somehow brings integration for me.
And I know it took you about 5 years to write. I know people always have questions about that when writers say it takes a certain amount of time to write. It's like, are you, I think Gone Girl took about like 3.5 years. I was doing, it's like, were you focusing entirely and like writing and rewriting and finding out what the book was, or did you hit a certain point and it's all just amazing rewrites from there on out? Or how does that work for you when you're with them one of your works for more than 4 seasons?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I wrote this book when I had 2 very young children, and I was also teaching at Brooklyn College. And so writing time, because of when it came in my life, it was really scarce. Yeah. And so a lot of the book was written, I would try to schedule in an hour, like after I had taken care of my family and before I was going to teach. And so I think you can actually see that energy in the book. It's a book about a working mother, written by a working mother. There are sometimes these micro chapters, and I don't want to say that my form is totally bound by the constraints of my life, but you know what, it kind of is. And I hope that energy of these were short, intense chapters. I was shoving this writing time, this kind of dark, explosive, energetic writing time into these little slots in my life. And so that's a lot of what the story of the process of the book, I would say.
I think that's great though, because, when people ask me about, how long did each book take, I'm always like, well, this one took this amount of time, but I was also had a full-time job. So I was the first 2, I had a full-time job and this and that. And so, I was writing it, nights and weekends. And this one, I had more time, and oddly enough, it took me longer to write because I had maybe more space. I had my first child in the middle of writing Gone Girl, and was for some reason at the time was very insistent that I was going to do the 3 months of maternity leave. Like yes, my job is slightly different, but I'm going to take these 3 months of maternity and bond with my child and, all this sort of stuff. And that turned out a very bad idea for me, because I came back to it after 3 months. I'm like, I don't know what this book's about. Like, I had completely forgotten certain things. Like, I don't know why this character's here. I can't remember this seems like it's supposed to be a plot point, but I don't know what it is. I mean, truly that crazy. And I guess in a way it was good, because certain things just fell to the side. It was like, well, I don't know what I meant for this to be doing, but it's not doing whatever I thought it was, and get out of the way. But yeah, I always feel like it's good for people who are struggling through that first novel to hear, like life happens. Like you're gonna have to you write around life. Doesn't work around your writing schedule, and because I think that helps demystify it a little bit. It's sort of like there's no, writers don't enter this special chamber where the all the birds are singing and the lights just so, and the muse comes down and gently touches us. It's like, no, it's not quite that romantic.
Yeah, I think that is really reassuring. And some writer in an interview and said, I don't want to read books written by people who have enough time to write books. So I always cling to in those times when I get overwhelmed. It's okay if this is the thing that you're kind of having an affair with while the rest of your life is also demanding your attention. That's okay. You can still, you're still a writer, even if you're writing it amid certain chaos. And I think that's something to keep in mind during the pandemic too, when making art can seem a little hard and there's a lot of distractions, but even just fitting it in a little bit.
Absolutely. I tell people, I like, can you write a page a day? Like, yes, you can write a page a day. I was like, well, by the end of the year, you do a page a day, you got your first novel there. Like, it may be in horrible shape and you're gonna have to do a lot of rewriting, but like, think of that. Like, it's just finding that time to, and usually once you sit down and write one page, you have to write the next page, right? So can you tell that someone is trying to finish a first draft and is giving herself a real pep talk here? You can do it.
I'm with you. I'm working on a first draft too. So it's the other end of the process from what we're talking about with The Need. I'm like, oh yeah, that's a book I actually finished. And right now I'm just in this nascent, total messy stage. So yes, I appreciate the pep talk. We are convincing ourselves.
Right, exactly. I feel like you and I would we would be pretty good writing partners, because I also am someone who's prone to writing down notes about a book, whatever it is. And I usually do mine that's like just sticky notes, and then I'll just stick it to the wall of my office. And like by the end of Gone Girl, Gone Girl's there is a lot of plot to it. There's a lot of different, there's Amy's checklists and all these, the different things that everything that's happening. And anything I wanted to check, and I'm totally OCD about my fact checking. Like, even if I learn the correct fact and I go ahead and make up my own fact, I still like to know the correct answer. So, but like by the end, like my office was connected to this unfinished basement, this really scary unfinished basement you had to go through to get to the office. It's like Chicago, this old like boarding house mother-in-law apartment. So you ran through this unfinished basement that also had a root cellar because it was like from Victorian era, and so which I was pretty sure obviously an armed man was going to leap out at some point with a chainsaw and obviously attack me. But then it was also where our guest bedroom was. And so by the end, it was like we had guests, and I'd be like, come walk through this incredibly frightening basement. And now we'll go to your guest quarters, which are featured just with like these flickering, flowing little bits of paper that have been taped all over that say crazy things like, is mom dead yet? Or when did they stop making Zima, which was this old malt liquor that I made a joke about because it was the first thing I drank. But I was like, were they still around in 19 whatever? So it was total crazy person house. But because I like that, I remember you saying like that, like you're, called a document for lack of better words, but it'd have everything from like a cool overheard conversation to like a moment from a dream you had. And was it really that diverse across? And are your books always like that?
Yeah, it's a total nonsensical document and even why these particular notes or why that particular overheard conversation goes with that particular newspaper headline, and why these things will make sense together. So after I've assembled that document of all these scraps, it's just scraps, then the huge next part of the writing process is just sorting those 100 pages into some kind of order and being like, okay, this note on page 30 is totally connected to this thing on page 69. I need to cut and paste and get them together. I hope this isn't too technical, but that's how I do it.
I think it's fascinating. And what percentage of those things that you keep throughout a year do you feel like you end up using in a book? Like,
I don't know what I can say.
Rough ballpark.
Yeah, well, the book I'm working on right now, I cut so much as I'm going along. So right now I'm about 150 pages into the book that I'm working on, and I have a document that's 120 pages of things that I've cut from it already. So the cuts are almost as much as the text itself.
Yeah.
So I reject a lot as I go along.
Mm-hmm. And do you just boot that to a new file that's like, might use this for something else?
Yeah. Yeah, I keep it all. I think it would be very hard to cut mercilessly, as we were talking about Ursula Le Guin earlier, but she, kill your darlings and cut mercilessly. Yeah. But I keep them somewhere so that I don't feel evil for leaving them behind.
Right. That's sort of like a long time ago, I got in a very dangerous habit of when I would go to flea markets, if anyone had old photographs for sale, usually it was because the frame was kind of cool. I had to buy them because I was so worried about these poor people from 50 years ago who are like floating around this unknown flea market with no home. I was like, where's your home? So I have this massive collection of other people's photos, but wow. Often with like little backstories behind them, just because I feel like they deserve like a home.
They deserve a home. So do you hang them on your wall or just keep them in an album, or?
So that's the question that I've been asking actually during, like, as I look for my next house project, like, do I dedicate like a little wall, in my office to all these friends of mine, or is that just one step too crazy? Right now they're just in a dedicated desk drawer. But
I think it's interesting. I mean, as a writer, you're trying to imagine other people's lives. So to have some kind of people you don't know, but yeah. I would hang them on the wall. But okay. That's just my 2 cents.
Well, as future writing partners, I wanted to get your permission on this. So.
Thank you. I will be joining you at your desk, so it better be on the wall.
anyone you want to send my way that you come across, let me know.
I will. Random photos. So I have a question for you. So after you had your child and then you went back to Gone Girl, so you were a different person. Like I feel like that's partly what you were saying. You were a different person with different concerns. So how did you reconnect to that project? Like how did you find your way through it at that time?
It was truly awful, and I'm laughing about it now because I can, but like at the time it really was sort of like, who wrote all this? Like you're sleep deprived too, on top of everything. You're exhausted and your brain's not still quite working right. And, I'd be reading this and, and and I had rewritten a lot at that point because was very much, I don't outline. I don't know the end of my books when I start them at all. And so it really was this kind of panic of like, oh, did I make the wrong decision a couple of rewrites-ish ago, and like that's why it doesn't feel like it's working. Like the stuff that worked was stuff that kind of always worked, and the stuff that still wasn't working was stuff that still wasn't working and that had always been trouble. And there was a question, originally my first draft didn't have any of Amy's diary in it, so it was entirely Nick's point of view.
And I can't even imagine that. I mean,
wow. Yeah, and at the time, I think my thought was I had to decide if she was going to be revealed and become part of the story kind of in the middle of the book, the way she is now, or if it was going to be like not until the very end, and we, you'd put it together, or, I wasn't sure, but she wasn't in there, and I just realized I kept really wondering who this person was, and like wanting to hear more from her. So I started to do the diary thing, but I was really nervous about it at the time because I was like, this is either going to work or it's really not going to work. It's either going to drastically not work, or, it'll work. There's no there's no partly working out any twists like that. So it was a while to get back into it. I mean, I think I just I sat down and I put in a separate document everything I would just wasn't sure was working, or even like why it was there to begin with. It was different things like Nick's sister Go was originally his best friend from childhood, and they had been secret lovers. I mean, it was they had originally all been based in Chicago, so there's tons of Chicago stuff because I had been really wanting to write about Chicago and realized that didn't work. Amy's childhood originally, what there was no Amazing Amy book series. It was her family ran a kind of a high-end matchmaking kind of business, like a curated matchmaking. And it was just crazy. So it was just sort of like, I'm just gonna just rip off the Band-Aid and get back to it and not spend too much time agonizing about if only I had, or maybe I can save this part. I always feel, I don't know about you, but I usually feel like if I'm saying to myself any version of the phrase, like, maybe I can save this if, or this might work if, it's usually I'm trying to save something that shouldn't be there. Like I either like had a good, like really liked the actual words that I wrote, but it has no business being in the book or something like that.
Yeah. That's why that side document where you just throw things that you have to get rid of, it makes it easier to get rid of if you have that. But so I mean, I guess a question for you, and I mean, I know we can both ask questions, right? Because I have another question for you about momentum. So a lot of things changed, but how did you achieve the momentum that the story has? Was that there from the beginning, or was that hard won, or what would you say about momentum and suspense?
For me, the momentum wasn't too difficult. And particularly because I knew the style that I was going to write, and I knew that I definitely wanted it to feel, I knew that, it's a book where you spend the first 150 pages and you don't necessarily know anything is that wrong. You're in this couple's relationship. And so I figured people were only going to have a certain amount of patience, and I was going to have to keep raising the stakes. And my dad was a film professor, and he had grown up as a child on all the great old serial cliffhanger movies that they would air before the longer films, and was so very early on was this is a cliffhanger, that is our version of page turner. This is how you keep people interested. You have to give them a reason to that they would stay with you. And so certainly I think just knowing, I knew I kind of wanted to end each chapter with that sort of oh wait, now I've got to see what the next chapter is. So for me, it was the middle part that was the most tricky as far as momentum, where it's sort of you've had a big twist. You don't know entirely what's gonna happen next, nor did I. And so I felt like that one was the one where I did a big portion of when they're in the Ozarks and there's the grifters, and that was the most I got a little bit of time to kill before the next part of the book happens, and I'm sort of bound by that a little bit by plot, which I don't love being, but it was so it was that kind of thing. And I was going to ask you, I mean, I have certain little tricks that I do personally that help me when I'm writing, and I want to ask you the same if you have for your writing. One thing I do for pretty much all my main characters is I have this old-fashioned, it's totally I think it probably literally came from my undergrad fiction writing class, where it's almost like a questionnaire if your character were going to answer it. So it's everything from does he or she eat breakfast? Does he or she send a card for people's birthdays? Does he or she, would they laugh or roll their eyes at this? Would they, like, this kind of long, and it like really forces me in a very specific way to add character and really think about this character in really specific ways, and kind of get to know them in ways that I might not otherwise. And sometimes it will reveal something kind of interesting to me that way. And then the second is like, I don't believe in writer's blocks. I believe in really awful writer's years that stretch on for multiple years at a time, but not writer's blocks. But the one thing I've always told people with that I have always found helpful is, you can't stop writing your book, but the option I will give myself is to, for instance, write a scene that completely takes place outside of the confines of the book, that are between two characters that, you don't see it, like one of the main characters and a lesser known character. For instance, like, with Nick's parents at his, third grade parent teacher conference, what's the teacher from the teacher's point of view, or at boarding school, Amy's roommate, and something from that point of view, or anything like that. And I found that can also help me. So I was curious if you, number one, if you get writer's blocks, number two, if you find your characters like entirely organically, or you find they start revealing themselves to you, or do you dig in with certain parts of them?
I feel like I always find it really interesting when people do those intricate lists of things for characters. And I think it's probably really helpful to know all of that stuff, but I've never done it that way. So what I usually do if I'm having trouble getting hold of a character is just, I feel like putting them in a really hard conversation and seeing what they say in dialogue. And then if the dialogue is off, I'll be like, okay, that's not quite them. Okay, so let's try the dialogue again. Okay, wait. Oh, maybe they're talking too much. They'd actually be talking less and they would have more gestures. I feel like I know them when they're having a hard conversation. And that was really true in Writing the Need when Molly encounters her nemesis, I'll say, although I don't really think that's quite the right word, but the conversations that those two characters have, I worked so hard on them, and through the ways they would speak to each other in their most difficult conversations where they both really wanted something from each other. Yeah. That's when I could finally come to grasp them. They were weird to write because they're similar in so many ways and different in some really critical ways also. Mm-hmm. So I feel like through conversation.
Do you say the words out loud to yourself so you can like feel the rhythms?
I read it aloud I mean, when I am sometimes I have to work in a public place and I'm always like, I put a hoodie on and just kind of talk to myself. But I prefer writing in a private place because so much of writing for me is I'm talking to myself very often, especially when I'm writing dialogue, because it can look okay on the page, but then it can, sound horrible when you say it. So I feel like you have to really be speaking to yourself.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to, for anyone who's watching who has not read The Need yet, I always hate to try to summarize anyone else's book. If you had to say, like, in about a sentence, other than what we've established from your lovely chapter reading, is there any points? I'm also scared because I never want to give more away than I ever should, but anything that you feel is important when you're describing the book to someone?
Well, I think let's see. Yeah, when I describe it, my elevator pitch is very similar to the first chapter. Like, a woman is home alone with her 2 young children and she hears an intruder in the other room. But I think to go beyond that, the intruder turns out to know many, many things, many intimate details about her life. And the intruder also is going to ask her to make basically a moral decision about doing something that requires kind of the deepest generosity. And so I don't know, I feel like it's a book that's kind of parading as a thriller. There are things about the beginning of it that make it feel like a thriller. There's suspense, and I love the cliffhangers. I love cliffhangers partly because when I was reading as a kid, I loved cliffhangers so much, and that childish delight stays with me. I think it stays with all of us, just what's going to happen next. But the book really shades into something else, and as the identity of the intruder becomes more clear, our ideas of who's a threat and who isn't, I think, shift over the course of the books.
I'm also always fascinated. Your main character is a paleobotanist, which to me is just so perfect. Like in a book that's where your book is has a very wonderful physicality to it. I love, you know, the weight of the weight of the child on your hip, or, you know, those moments of lactation, that idea of, like you said, you know, you are responsible for this child on so many levels, and that idea of your body as becoming part of this link to the life cycle in a way that hadn't thought about. How important was it to you that, or, you know, how do you pick something like that? Paleobotanist is so specific.
It's so random. I'm going to turn on my light because I feel like I'm vanishing into the dusk. Okay. Let's see if I can get, and then I'm going to answer that question. Okay, maybe that's a little better. Yeah, I'm very interested in the body and trying to write about the body, trying to write about the physical experience of having a body, and the way that your mind can think one set of things and your body can think another set of things. So I was thinking about physicality a lot as I was writing, because as you said, I don't think the experience of biological motherhood changed my experience of having a body and using my body that way really in both really awe-inspiring and also frightening ways brought me closer to my body. But in terms of her being a paleobotanist, that is something that came kind of late in the game. I had a complete draft of the book, and I had all these scenes at her workplace, and I knew she was doing something that involved excavating the earth, and the idea that her job was to like penetrate the layers and try to understand something mysterious that didn't make sense, that was always there. So she was an archaeologist in the first draft, but I wasn't satisfied. I didn't feel like I knew enough about her profession. And by chance, my in-laws have a friend whose daughter is a paleobotanist. And just by chance, I was like, you know what, maybe I'll just talk to a paleobotanist. I don't know anything about it. Maybe that could be relevant to the book. And we had this, for me, earth-shattering 2.5-hour conversation on the phone. This paleobotanist, I'll give her a shout out, Dr. Sarah E. Allen, who's incredible. And she told me something that was the detail that enabled the plot to fall into place. And what she explained to me was that paleobotanists are often mystified by fossils they find. Did I define it? Maybe I forgot to define it. So it's the study of plant fossils, which honestly, before I spoke to her and got all into this field, I'm not sure I knew that off the top of my head. So it's the study of plant fossils. And so she revealed to me, or explained to me, that often paleobotanists, I just assume that the fossil, it sounds so dusty, it sounds so set in stone, like it's the fossil record, but the fossil record is incomplete. It will basically by definition always be incomplete because we just don't have fossil evidence of every life form that's ever existed. So the fact that you can be working as a paleobotanist and find mysterious fossils tied in perfectly with the fact that at the site where Molly works, she is finding fossils and other objects that defy understanding. So this was a real world detail. Paleobotanists actually have this confusion. And my book is not totally set in our reality, but it was a realistic thing that would enable certain mysteries to open up in the book. And I feel like when you're writing something that's speculative in nature, has something that's a little separate from our world, finding those things that are grounded in our world becomes extra important.
Mm-hmm. We're totally writing partners, because that's totally how I feel too. Is like, you can go to those out there heightened reality, surreality, that you can go to pretty far places as long as you nail down the details so that the world feels like a real place that you can see and hear. And you're not trying to be vague in order to get around some basic homework, and also just that that people react to abnormal situations in a realistic way, that you could see it. Maybe not realistic for the reader, but that you're like, oh yeah, okay, like this makes sense. So I do you find that once you have research, when it's something like paleobotany, or when you've done anything like that, how beholden do you feel at that point to sticking to the facts? Do you feel comfortable, like if you know the answer in real life, then you feel comfortable pushing a little bit more for the sake of the creativity and the story? Or how beholden do you become?
I feel like part of the reason that I write, I would say that pretty much all the fiction I write has some element that's not quite our world, and that freedom is really important to me. So as much as I did a lot of research about paleobotany, I talked to Dr. Allen many times, and getting certain details right of like, what are the tools that you would use and what would be the workflow at a site like this? All of those questions were important to me. But I also feel like with any facts that I learn in my research, I have established a world where I can take certain liberties with those. And a lot of the joy for me comes from that freedom. So I try to not feel too beholden, but I also feel like a fact like what the tools are that you use is so physical and so grounding. And when you're trying, because sometimes what I'm trying to capture in my writing is they're abstract things and they're metaphors, and it's a way of trying to describe feelings. And so concrete objects like a chisel are just a good counterbalance to that, and are a good way of moving that, like embodying it, as we were talking about before, making these deeper questions take physical form.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you said chisel just now. I could completely feel the chisel in my hand, like the weight and the heft of it. And it struck me that in the need in particular, like I felt like I knew, I just was, like I said before, I felt very physically manifested in that world. Like I felt like I knew the weight of things, or the smell of something, or you did such a beautiful job. And it's never showy or like a writer, the like, oh, watch me dazzle you here, like with this information. It's just like, I just felt like I was just very present in that world. And I don't know, are you aware of that as a writer normally, or did you feel it was particularly important for this story?
I mean, as I said, I felt like as I was writing it, I kept thinking to myself, this is a book about the body. This is a book about the body.
Mm-hmm.
And that imperative has never been as present in my other work as it was in this one. I think just because she, at one point she talks about how when she was pregnant, she felt this sense of God weight, that old idea that gods weighed, like Athena weighed so much, the gods were so heavy. And that term God weight often flashed through my mind when I was pregnant, and you just feel like superhumanly heavy. And those kind of feelings of just being present in your body, even when your mind is demanding you to contemplate other things or to be engaged with your work. I'm just interested in this experience of having a human body at a time when we often ask a lot of our brains and kind of ignore our bodies sometimes. Yeah. So I'm glad it felt physical for you, because that was totally on my mind as I was writing.
Yeah, definitely. And when you were just saying that, right now during this particularly strange time, I wonder if the reading experience of The Need would feel different. Just that protectiveness we have over our children, that that, that great, hold on, I even wrote down the first line because I've always loved that first line so much, where it was uh, basically that idea, uh, a mother clinging to her children in the dark, scared of an unseen threat. Isn't that what mothers have been doing forever? What that, if one would feel differently if you were reading The Need right now. Have you heard from people who have remarked one way or the other at all?
I haven't heard any particular comments from readers about that, of what it's like to read it right now during a time that that we might feel like we're a little bit crouched in the dark.
Yeah.
But I'm scared of my book, so I can't reread it. And I don't know if I ever will. Do you ever reread your books? When I give readings, I have to reread them, but my books scare me.
I just know I'll go straight to all the stuff I wish I had changed, or I'll find the one typo or something. It's just that then I know it's forever lurking out there in the bookshelves for me.
Yeah, it's hard to revisit as much as it still feels like the book is almost a part of me, my body. I also can. It's hard to revisit.
Tell me what you have such an incredibly unique voice and vision. I mean, it's just really, I told you when we were chatting before we started, like, I discovered you because of that amazing blurb that you got from Ursula K. Le Guin. And I was just kind of like, well, obviously I will be reading that. And the blurb itself is so beautiful. And she herself was such a utterly unique writer. So I'm curious about, your life growing up. I remember you said that you were interested in being a writer from a pretty young age. Did you grow up with parents who were big readers or big writers? And did that seem like a lofty aspiration, or did that seem like a viable, did it feel like, was it over here like rock star, or was it accountant?
Well, my mother actually has written several nonfiction books.
Oh, okay.
And so I grew up with a writer. She wrote, her name is Susan Zimmerman. She wrote a memoir about my older sister, Catherine, who had the rare neurological disorder Rett syndrome, to whom the book is dedicated. Mm-hmm. And then she wrote some books in the education field. So the idea that a woman needs a room of one's own, and that a woman can be a writer and can manifest that creativity on the page, I was very lucky to grow up with that. I also, as soon as I could tell a story and write it on the page, I was like, this is the most satisfying human endeavor. And I was so young, and I just took so much, I don't know if joy is the right word. It is my flow activity. Like, when I'm doing that, when I'm trying to capture the world by language and by stories, I feel the most myself. So, I mean, it's not always blissful. That makes it sound so blissful. Like, it's often hard, but I just feel like I'm myself when I'm doing it. So.
Yeah, I always find when I'm in the state of actual writing, like if I'm just having a good couple weeks and I'm really into a book or whatever, I'm just a more observant person in general. I find, like, I notice things more, I'm more engaged in the world, and I also have, for me, a lot more perspective. Like, for me, things tend to feel much less overwhelming and I just become much more resilient as a human being. And I think it's just maybe that search for the right word, like that, just having that vocabulary, being able, like you said, to articulate something. Like, there's a certain power in that's, for me, is always really, really healthy, even if I'm not enjoying the writing process per se, but like just that act. I feel like I'm a better version of myself than, watching the 8th hour of The Bachelorette, eating Velveeta.
I'm sure that's a good version too. But yeah,
exactly.
I remember, there's an interview or something with George Saunders where he says the great thing about revision, I'm paraphrasing, is that you have the opportunity to become the best version of yourself and to make the work the best version of itself. And I love that idea. Like in life, we can always be like, oh, I said the wrong thing. I didn't express my feelings well enough to that person. I failed. I didn't say the right thing to my students. But in writing, by doing draft after draft, there's this satisfaction of getting the opportunity that you don't usually get in life to kind of get it right and nail it. And there's a lot of joy in that amid all of the many failures of language on a daily basis. But here's one place where, I mean, of course, our books are still full of failures where we, you know, you can't read it again because you'll be worried about the places you messed up.
Catch that word rep.
Yeah.
Oh, hold on, let's see if I can find this. I have not left you. I'm coming right back.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
I was just seeing my mom just dropped off a couple of old bits of my work.
Oh.
Here, for instance.
What age?
This is looking, I'm gonna go 5th grade.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just the opening of the opening line. It was dark, way past bedtime, but a thin man with a long knife and an evil, leering smile was under Katie's bed.
See, there you have it. That's the first line of your next novel. That's great.
There, see, I say I'm learning and just save this stuff.
Yeah.
Sooner or later, someone will want it.
So were you a writer from a young age also? Did you feel that? Yeah.
Yes, I did. I was lucky, and I grew up in a house where storytelling was very important. It was not devalued at all. It was very like, of course, this is how we all make sense of the world. This is how we get to know each other. It's how we understand people who are different from us. It's how, it's how useful and important it is. And like I said, my dad is a film professor. My mom taught reading, a lot of remedial reading for comprehension for college students who needed a couple extra classes on that. So my dad was either taking me to a movie or my mom was putting a book in my hand. And so that was very early influence. I didn't think, it's from Kansas City, Missouri. Like it wasn't a place where it was like, obviously, and then you'll head down and get your agent and off you'll go. And, it was a much farther, to me, it was much more of a rock star kind of dream. So I went into, but I steered immediately toward journalism. That to me seemed like the pragmatic way to be able to write and get paid for, that was the whole plan. So yeah, from a really young age, was always writing stories. And
but I read that you said that being a journalist helped you made you able to be a fiction writer, right?
Absolutely. I mean, partly because it really did demystify the whole process of writing. I worked at a weekly magazine for 10 years, wrote the first 2 books while I still had my full-time job, and we had a pretty lean staff, so I was writing stuff every single day pretty much, whether it may have been a 300-word box to go with a photo or whatever it was, but you learn that you just can't set your alarm and like I'll wake up and write. The muse will be here by then and I'll be ready to go. It definitely taught me to write on deadline, taught me to write whether or not I feel like it, because you can write your way into feeling like it, or at least I can, I feel like. And it taught me not to be overly precious about stuff, like, kill your babies, that, sometimes even though this whole entire column was, you wrote your heart out on this, but we don't have room for it, or like it doesn't fit here, it doesn't make, you're making a point that doesn't belong here. And just learning to sort of like, all right, hit delete and start over. But I have a deep love of the rewriting process, though. I could For me, the first draft is always very tense making because I don't know how it's going to end or when it's going to end and all that. But then once I have it all there, and can see where the problems are and what I need to work on and, where I phone certain things in and, just all that and can really get into it. I love every part of the rewrite process. I really do. How about you?
I I mean, I do feel like there's nothing like that initial burst, that first draft where I agree that it's the most daunting draft. I also find it the most like extravagantly exciting draft in a certain way. But I always call it draft zero because I feel like I write, which is a tip I highly recommend. Like it's draft zero. And then, so I feel like I write my book once and then I actually write my book.
Yeah. Yeah.
The draft zero is really just like, it's fun and it's completely confusing and I have no idea what I'm doing. And then by the time I get to the end of draft zero, I'm like, okay, now I can write the book.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think I share your feelings.
It's much more positive. I like that it feels more positive that way. It's like, it feels like I would be giving myself more permission a little bit on that first
Call
draft.
it draft zero. I'm telling you, I've been doing this for a while and it really helps.
That's sort of like I never ever write a first sentence of a book. Like I just start somewhere in the middle of that paragraph because otherwise I worry I'm just jinxing myself and I spend 5 days trying to figure out, what that line is and that when I've finished writing the book, that's what I do that's the first revision I make is to add now that I know what the book's about, to add that opening first sentence.
I think a lot of it is figuring out ways to take pressure off yourself.
Right.
That is a lot of my little rituals or methods are all about taking pressure off because it's very hard to be creative when you feel a lot of pressure, I think.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That Greek chorus of like, is this too much like what she did before? Is it not enough? Is this, I don't know. I have to get them all off my shoulders.
Yeah.
I see that we are about up on an hour. I don't know if we have questions, if our moderators have any questions from the audience for us.
Not at this time.
Anything.
A lot of thank yous for updating them, but no questions at this time.
Okay.
Great. Well, I'm sure we could talk for another 7 hours, but it is getting to be dinner time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. And you always have an office to work from if you find yourself in Chicago.
I'll be there along with the pictures of strangers on the wall. That sounds quite delightful.
Perfect. It's a date.
Great.
All right. Take care.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
Madison Street Books.
Thank you, Helen and Gillian, for joining us this evening. It was terrific. We really, really appreciate it. And we will be sure to get it posted on Facebook. And we will also give an opportunity for people to write their questions. And then one way or another, we'll get them to you. And then you guys, if you want to get answers back to us on some level, and we'll post those as well. And again, apologies for the technical difficulties. And thanks so much for being with us this evening.
Of course. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.